Sega.
Puyo Puyo is a puzzle game that's almost one part Tetris, one part columns. Blocks, made from two squishy Puyo creatures, fall from the top of the screen and you can rotate them, like Tetris, whilst matching up colours causes the blocks to be erased with blocks above them falling down, like columns. However, Puyo Puyo has even more strategy than the other games, as it's about chaining together popping Puyos for maximum effect. Doing well causes transparent garbage Puyos to be sent into your rival's board, making their life more complicated. This game was widely known in the West initially as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine on the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis console, but none of the PC versions retain that name, apart from the emulated Mega Drive versions, which I'm not looking at. The first game we'll look at is the Sega arcade version released in 1992 on the System C2 hardware. Then I'll compare it to the Japanese-only PC ports, firstly the earlier 1995 Windows 3.1 version, and then the later 1996 Windows 95 and above version. However, the original game didn't make it to the US, instead the game mechanics were licensed by Spectrum Holobyte and used in a game called Qwirks, which released in 1995, so we'll take a look at that. Finally, in 2021, Yakuza 6 The Song of Life included an arcade game called Puyo Puyo, so we'll look into what that actually was, as it's clearly not really related to the earlier titles. The arcade version of Puyo Puyo was created by Compile and Sega in 1992. This wasn't the original version of the game though, as it debuted on the Japanese MSX2 and Famicom Disk System hardware the previous year, but the arcade version heavily focused on the two-player mode. The game features characters from Compile's earlier Mado Monogatari RPG games, known as Sorcery Saga in the West, but the story of those is unimportant to Puyo Puyo. You play as a young girl with magical powers called Al Nadja, who is the main protagonist of the RPG games. The intro sequence shows the logo bouncing into place with various opponents behind it. This is then followed by an extensive demo of how to play the game, which really digs into how chain reactions can be used. Although I understand this well, doing it in practice in-game requires you to think several steps in advance, which I'm not very good at. After the demo you see the high scores, then the title appears in a stretchy way. A gameplay demo then follows. The title can also stretch into place and warp all over the place. When you start the game, you can choose between 1 and 2 player mode, then choose a difficulty level. The two opponents then smack talk each other, and the game begins. There's not much to say here, I try my best, but I'm hopeless at planning chain reactions. I do eventually get lucky and slam a lot of clear Puyos into my rival's board and win the match. Hey! The next opponent is a strange one called Wish, which leads to this amusing exchange. It looks like I'm doing badly, before a couple of unplanned chain reactions sets me on the course to victory. I'm lucky sometimes. Another rival appears, even stranger than the last one. This is weird. However, they're also a better player than me, so eventually I get beaten by foot. Stepped on, you could say. Here's the game over screen, and I didn't make the high score table. Now here's a minute of this version without me talking over it.
got me!
The Japanese-only Windows PC version was released and re-released a fair number of times, as all these boxes and CD-ROMs show. Broadly speaking, there are two key variants, the initial Windows 3.1 version with just 256 colours, and an updated version for Windows 95 and above with better graphics. We'll take a look at both in turn. Here's the title screen for the Windows 3.1 version, which is ported by Quest and Both Tech. This is followed by a high score table for various modes, before a rolling demo of gameplay on this rather brightly coloured stage. This sequence then repeats. There's no how to play demo like the arcade. When you start the game, there are a number of modes beyond 1 and 2 player, but we'll stick with single player here. The same difficulty setting appears before the animated face-off. In the Japanese version, they talk about who's the most beautiful. It's rather different to the English arcade version. The game itself is higher resolution than the arcade, but also a little bit flat due to the lack of backgrounds behind each board. Once again, I show off my lack of Puyo Puyo skills for a while, before somehow beating my rival. And it's time for
Fish!
Another round commences and I gradually lose control of the game. There's quite a big pause when the music swaps, but not long until I lose. The game over screen is here as per the arcade version. Now watch a minute of this version.
Go!
The game eventually got updated to Windows 95 and above with better graphics. This version has a smaller play area to include buttons for minimising and quitting the game. You'll also notice from the demo that the boards now have backgrounds behind them, which is nice. Some of the sound effects break up a little here though, but that might be down to me running it on Windows 10. The game menu and difficulty pages are the same, as is the opening introduction, but it looks a lot better than the Windows 3.1 version.
Go!
So, the game begins. This version feels a bit more finicky to play, with pieces often moving further left and right than you wish. It also feels a bit faster than the Windows 3.1 version. The buttons at the bottom allow you to pause, abort, minimise and quit the game. Despite this game looking so much better, I eventually failed to beat the first opponent. The game over screen looks good though. Now for a minute of this version.
Go!
The Japanese PC versions were never ported to the West. However, in 1995, Spectrum Holobyte licensed the Puyo Puyo game mechanics from Compile and released Qwirks. They tried to add weight to the product by getting Tetris creator Alexei Pachinov to introduce the game, but he doesn't really appear in the game at all. The intro is very minimal, with this title screen and a jaunty tune. I mean, it is a nice tune with lots of sections, and here I'm using MIDI instruments to play it back, but ultimately that's all there is. You can view high scores though. Qwirks has a number of game modes itself, with this puzzle mode essentially acting as a tutorial for how chain reactions work. As you can see, apart from the Puyos, which are now called Qwirks, the stages look totally different here. But what about the main challenge mode? You begin in this weird purple dome, supposedly an intergalactic zoo, with a large wasp rival called Wuzza. The gameplay is essentially then identical to Puyo Puyo. Like many previous versions of this game, I struggle, but eventually defeat the wasp. And next is a two-headed duck called Feagle. The main storyline for this game is that in 2581, some evil warlords of Zapf infested the intergalactic zoo with Qwirks, which turn the animals evil, and so you defeat the animals by herding Qwirks together. I'm not sure what the story writers were smoking, this is wild. But back to the game, and it turns out that a two-headed duck is better than me. At least I got a new high score. The game over screen isn't really a thing here. Here's a minute of this version. Yakuza 6: A Song of Life was released in 2021 on the PC and features a number of playable Sega arcade games. One of these is Puyo Puyo, which has a wall of cabinets in-game, but it's clearly unrelated to the 1992 arcade version, so what is it? I decided to dig into the game's minigame folder, and you can immediately see something interesting here, a folder called Tetris. Now, compare this to the folder for Puyo Puyo Tetris, and you can see a lot of similarities. Basically, the version of Puyo Puyo inside Yakuza 6 is a cutback version of Puyo Puyo Tetris, and shares much of the graphics from that game. You can find the game inside Club Sega. Unlike many of the other arcade games, there are no difficulty levels available for this one. Sega! The intro consists of a lightly animated title screen, then some demo gameplay. Now, one thing you might notice is that the background street sounds still play over the arcade game, which is either realistic or annoying, depending on your preference. Sega! When you start the game, you can read the game rules or just get stuck in. Much like Puyo Puyo Tetris, a different voice calls out the Sega scream each time. Sega! The character select screen is identical to Puyo Puyo Tetris, but there's no storyline or character introductions here, it's right into the action. Only the background character image in each board makes it clear who you're playing. In this case, I'm up against the fish. This version of the game feels more generous, as I rarely chain together many attacks, yet manage to win. Unlike previous games, your next rival comes in and starts playing right away, without your board being cleared. I managed to beat this rival too, and, eventually, the next one. But my fourth opponent proves too much. Despite a close fight, I get smashed at the end, and it's game over with a score breakdown and more of the background street noise. Here's a minute of this version.
Music start! Skipping! 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 Sorry!
Let's compare 4 screens of the arcade version to the various ports. For this I'll use the Japanese arcade version so that it's in line with the Japanese PC versions. First up, here's the title screen from the arcade. Wiping across to the Windows 3.1 version, you can see it's quite different. And wiping across to the Windows 95 version, you can see how much better, yet smaller the graphics are. Qwirks' title screen is pretty much the box artwork, whilst Yakuza 6's version is totally different and much more up to date. Next, here's a shot from the first intro sequence on the arcade version. The Windows 3.1 version is wider and features crisper artwork, whilst the Windows 95 version looks best of all, but is a little smaller. Qwirks has no intro, just a little text description of your rival, whilst Yakuza 6 has no intro at all, just a character select screen. Here's a gameplay shot of the arcade, which is nicely detailed. The Windows 3.1 version is sharper, but lacks the backgrounds, whilst the Windows 95 update looks gorgeous, but again is a bit smaller due to the extra buttons at the bottom. Qwirks' gameplay is pretty uninspiring to look at, unless you're a fan of the colour purple. And the Yakuza 6 version is nice, but in many ways I prefer the look of the Windows 95 version more. Finally, here's the Game Over screen in the arcade version, which features animated text. The Windows 3.1 version is more static, and the lack of colours shows here, whilst the Windows 95 version looks like a well-coloured cartoon. Qwirks, as mentioned, has no Game Over screen, just this boring pop-up window, whilst the Yakuza 6 version features the newly redrawn characters and a breakdown of your score. Let's put all 5 games head to head. Puyo Puyo is an interesting, fairly unique and tactical puzzle game. It's one you'll either gel with or find fairly impenetrable. There's not much middle ground here. The arcade version is actually quite tricky compared to the other versions I found. The Windows 3.1 version is sharper but also a touch easier, but looks a bit simple without the backgrounds. The Windows 95 version looks great, but plays a bit twitchily compared to the Windows 3.1 version. Qwirks is just a bit too odd to be fun, and lacks the presentation of the official games. And the Yakuza 6 version is just a massively cut back Puyo Puyo Tetris. If you like this comparison of Puyo Puyo, then give it a like, or subscribe, ring the bell or leave a comment, and join me next time for the 3D fighting game that changed everything.